This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. China's newly appointed Foreign Minister Qin Gang kicked off a five-nation week-long tour of Africa this week, continuing a decades-long tradition of making Africa the first destination of the year for every Chinese foreign minister. What's on the itinerary for the visit? What are the pressing issues in China-Africa relations? And how can the trip help set the stage for advancing ties to the next level of cooperation and mutual understanding? To help us answer these questions, I'm joined today by Ovigwe Eguegu, a policy analyst at Development Reimagined, Ronald Kato, senior journalist at Africanews and Analyst and Commentator on China-Africa relations, Wenping, senior research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Professor Josef Gregory Mahoney from East China Normal University. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion. I will start with Wenping. This is, again, the first trip or overseas trip for the Chinese foreign minister, and this time around, the newly appointed foreign minister, and his Qin Gang's first trip overseas is to the five nations in Africa and, of course, headquarters of African Union and Arab League. What do you make of this trip?
Well, first of all, this is a long tradition. Chinese foreign diplomacy, has been insisted on ever since 1991. By that time, then the Foreign Minister Qin visited a number of African countries. So ever since that year, so this first overseas trip in every new year now has been there. Now it's already 33 years long. So this is a tradition. So I should say this is a new phase. But to consisting this old tradition, because Qin Gang now is our new foreign minister. I think he made this visit to meet the new friends. For other African colleagues, he is also a new face, to represent China's this foreign policy. So this is the first meeting. And the second meeting, of course, I think he will talk a lot with his counterpart and all those African leaders about how to continue push forward the China-African relations. Especially, he will visit two headquarters. One is the AU headquarters located in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Another headquarters is Arab League headquarters in Cairo of Egypt. One is the first stop. And Egypt will be his final stop. So you see the beginning, one very important country, Ethiopia, and then the final stop, Egypt, also very important country, both in Arab country and also African continent, and the two headquarters. So which means his visit not only to those African countries he will be, and also towards all the continent, and also even strengthen the ties with Arab countries as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a lot to cover. Ronald, obviously this is, we said 32, 33 times for the Chinese foreign minister to start their first overseas trip with African nations. Some people say this reflects this respect for African nations, this commitment and level of commitment from the Chinese side to African continent, all the close ties between the two sides. Maybe it's all about that. What do you make of this long tradition?
Thank you for having me again, Qinduo. I think it's a very important trip that Foreign Minister Qin Gang is undertaking. It comes at a very critical time, at a very critical stage in Sino-African relations era. But it's also a very important time for him. He's just assumed this post as China's foreign affairs minister. I think two things are on the agenda. First, it is to introduce himself, present himself before his African and Arab colleagues, to tell them that there is a new sheriff at the Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry. It's been several years of Mr. Wang Yi, and so many have been used to him. They know that these changes happen. So first thing is to introduce himself before his African colleagues, tell them, okay, here we are. But also the other important issue, I think, is to remind them that China is open. China only reopened last month officially to international countries on January 8th. And this is a very important issue. For the last 2 years of the pandemic, you could argue that China's presence, not just in Africa, but in the world, has been affected because of the so many pandemic restrictions. So this is an important moment for Foreign Minister Qin Gang to tell his African colleagues that China is open. You can come in and we can come to you, and for us to advance our bilateral relations.
Ovigwe, since January 8th, obviously, China reopens its borders, and the Ethiopian airline, for example, they have resumed all the flights, basically 28 of them, I believe, to different Chinese cities, Guangzhou, Beijing, Shanghai, and Chengdu. So this helps, obviously, with trade and also people-to-people exchange. But again, what do you see as the major topic, for Foreign Minister Qin Gang in dealing with his African colleagues and in meetings?
Yeah, so one of the things you just mentioned now is the Ethiopian Airlines. I think I just read a report in the middle of this interview that they're actually projecting that they're going to see flights into China exceed pre-pandemic levels in the coming months. So already it shows that the reopening up is actually expediting the people-to-people flows as was expected, because so many businesses and so many engagements have been planned in lead up to the opening up. So yes, that's one dynamic. But also I think his visit to the African continent is actually rich in symbolism and significance, in the sense that he has participated in the opening of the African CDC headquarters. You might recall that the African CDC headquarters used to be a U.S.-China collaboration project for African countries. But what we're seeing now is Africa and China moved on, given the fact that the U.S. was hesitant and had its own issues with the project. But today that project has been inaugurated. The first phase of it has been inaugurated, and it shows the strength and the commitment of China-Africa relationship to one another to actually build and deliver on substantively to the development of peoples. So I think that's also very important to mention. And then of course there's trade, which of course I just mentioned with the opening up, and that's also a very important thing. China-Africa trade, still growing strong, expected to even move further when these business deals continue between the entrepreneurs. So of course there's also an investment, and if you be following, we just heard from Djibouti announcement of a $1 billion investment by a Hong Kong-based Chinese firm into Djibouti that might be completed around 2027, which would then see a potential satellite launched from the African soil developed in Africa. So there's so much to look forward to with this type of high-profile visit, because there's so much on the table, and we're seeing African-China relations move towards new heights, and this visit is only going to contribute to strengthening that relationship.
Professor Mahoney, I know, for the Chinese side, this is just following its tradition and to continue its relationship with African nations. But of course, people, if you look at international media, it's always compared with what happened last month, for the African summit in Washington. So in that respect, how do you see this trip of Qin Gang?
Well, clearly, we had sort of a precursor to this when Biden went to the Middle East and was poorly received, and then President Xi went there and was very well received. We know that there was some mully-grubbing when Biden requested the various African leaders to come to Washington instead of him coming to Africa. and likewise some longstanding concerns of the U.S. as a global hegemon and what that means for China going forward. For Africa going forward, and indeed, whether or not the United States has moved past old paradigms like the Washington Consensus and other issues that had led to cyclical crises in Africa, including, for example, one of the major ones of the last 20 years, the global financial crisis, which was instigated by the U.S. in 2008, and which has continued to have ripple effects in Africa ever since. But I think what we're seeing here is, firstly the tradition, as was noted. I think also the new foreign minister is very happy after his rough treatment in Washington to go someplace where China is generally very well received. But I think also, what we're seeing is China expanding its concept of Asia. I think we saw this with the Middle East, and certainly, although Africa is not the Middle East, we do have, as has been noted, Egypt playing a vital role in the Arab League, and so this is a bridge. It's yet another bridge towards this ambition to have greater security and peace and co-development, both in Asia and Africa. So I think altogether, this is building on tradition, but also building on a clear vision for the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's take a look, closer look at the trade, for example, and investment between the two sides. Wenping, China has been the continent's largest trading partner for 13 consecutive years. Total two-way trade in 2021 reached over 254 billion, an increase, I believe, for more than 30%. And for example, in the first half of the year 2022, last year, it was about 137 billion. That represents a year-on-year increase of some 17% increase, despite the pandemic. So I mean that's something, given how disruptive the pandemic has proved to be, not only to China but also to international trade.
Yes, all those numbers you mentioned just tell us it's not easy to reach this kind of level between China and Africa, both like in trade and investment, and also lots of infrastructure, construction and industrialization at this process. Actually, before the pandemic, I traveled to Africa extensively, so it's very easy to see this China's presence in that continent in all kinds of ways. I think for Africa, people and African countries, the daunting challenge for them is to out of poverty, to develop themselves. I think so. China now offered this kind of partnership to join together with Africa for building those infrastructure, connectivity, and industrialization. So that's exactly those number you mentioned. That's the achievements we have been made. Given those years, even though during this pandemic time, because even though I haven't been there during the time, but I constantly hear those informations from the people I know based in Africa. For example, even the friends I know, they haven't been back to China all the time. They based in Africa, continue their work for those projects. For example, our Foreign Minister Qin Gang, he visited Ethiopia, and today I think he together with the AU, those leaders to join the ceremony of the African CDC, the disease this control the center, because this headquarters of African CDC has been built now finalized by Chinese company again. All those CDC building has been finished within this pandemic years. So you can imagine how many hard work behind that. When we saying some people can keep them safe, not contact with other people, but those Chinese workers, those engineers, they have to be there to finish the job, because they all know this is a time, you are running with the time. You have to build up this headquarters and then to help African people to fight this disease, to build, we call is a shared this future for this health and the public health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ronald, obviously the CDC headquarters is a part of the, Belt and Road Initiative, infrastructure construction. Along with that, obviously there are roads, ports, and let's say public institutions, hospitals, for example, schools. So how is this kind of like endeavor received in Africa?
Positively, Chinvo. I think if there's any impact that China has made in Africa, and which earns it a lot of goodwill from people in Africa, is the infrastructure. Many roads in Africa, many high-rise buildings in Africa, and increasingly digital infrastructure, internet connectivity, is associated with China. When people see a road being built, many times, even when it's not a Chinese company undertaking the construction, they'll think it is China. When they see a port being developed, when they see an expressway being built, when they see a hydropower dam being constructed, they'll say, even when it is not the case, China. So China has had a profound impact on Africa's infrastructure. There's still so much need. But so far, what has been done in terms of building railways, in terms of building bridges, you can tell that it is helping African countries integrate themselves into global trade connectivity, which would have been a hard feat had China not invested as much resources as it has in Africa's infrastructure. We must remember here that developing infrastructure in African countries, not just African countries, but all developing countries, is a very costly venture. It's not easy to get an infrastructure project done. It's very risky. It is very costly. It's why many countries keep away. So China has shown resilience here and shown the desire to work with Africa, because there's surely demand, and that demand needs you to have the sort of resources that China does, the sort of banks that China does, which can finance this infrastructure, very risky business, with money that other lenders wouldn't be willing to provide.
Mm-hmm. Well, a follow-up question for you, Ronald. I asked that question because there's this, you may call it like fake news, misinformation or rumor, China debt diplomacy because of loans, and of course there's loans to development, and then there's a debt issue, and now we know it has been there for years, and sometimes even developing countries, if you look at their media, they're talking about this debt issue. I mean, how big an issue is that?
It is interesting that it has been debunked so many times, but somehow it refuses to go away. I think the people that repeat it simply ignore the fact that there's no evidence for it, but it also persists because some key Western leaders have also repeated the claim. So it refuses to go away because I think some countries are using it as a way to attack the China-Africa relationship. But there's obviously no evidence to back it up. And African borrowers know better. Okay, the factors responsible for the debt problem some African countries find themselves in are very numerous, and you cannot pin them down to Chinese lending. Okay, rising interest rates, the global pandemic, the fall of commodity prices, a couple of years before the pandemic, all played a part. So it's a mix of so many things, but also China was key, for example, during the pandemic, in getting countries that requested assistance to stop them paying interest rates, something that many Western lenders, especially private ones, flatly refused to do. And that, of course, aggravated the debt situation in many African countries. They kept paying interest rates. Those that never did, they kept on accruing because they had to divert resources to control the pandemic. when China had actually allowed those countries that approached it for assistance to freeze the payment of interest rates and sometimes the principal itself.
Mm-hmm. Eguegu, if you look at the trade and investment and also infrastructure, some say it's partly based on the Chinese experience of development. For example, build a road and you can prosper, and connectivity is important to trade. And again, industrialization, right? You need to move the goods and people around. How do you see this, the Chinese priority, for example, in their relationship with African nations, in infrastructure, in technology, in education, in health, for example, with a lot of investment, a lot of trade?
I think it's very, very important to underscore the fact that several African countries have realized that the infrastructure model or the infrastructure investment model that China is taking with Africa actually, is very positive for African development. And not just even African countries realizing that, you see that the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure Initiative, PGI, and even the European Union's Global Gateway all came after the BRI. And I will always argue that those two initiatives by Western countries were introduced because they have recognized the positive impact that infrastructure investment has created in developing countries. So in a way, it's a validation of China's approach. And that's why many African countries who have been arguing even before those initiatives were put up by Western countries continue to work more closely with China. And also because if you even listen to what the Ethiopian Prime Minister said during the visit of the ongoing visit of Foreign Minister Qin Gang, he did say that there will be a strengthening of exchanges of governance experience between China and Ethiopia. And all of this is because of the fact that the countries have realized that when it comes to China-Africa relations, there is a model, and the model has been delivering, so far. So whether you're looking at for infrastructure, you're looking at trade, policy, policy coordination, financial inclusion, and people-to-people exchanges. So it's a very robust collaboration or cooperation. But it is also very important that African countries work to safeguard the relationship, because just like a previous speaker mentioned, the global environment actually presents a lot of risks to the relationship. And despite its own internal issues that, of course, China and African countries need to work on to better improve the relationship, because no relationship is perfect, there needs to be caution played to how the global environment and external forces might work, to put stumbling blocks in the China-Africa relationship.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ovigwe, you mentioned about this global risks. Possibly, I'm not sure whether that includes in the competition between U.S. and China. We mentioned a little bit about it in December, the Africa Summit in Washington. U.S. has been really careful not to mention the word China, but we know that that's the elephant in the room. So they are focusing on, say, China, U.S. and African relationship instead of countering the rise of China, which used to be the case. But people basically, you can say two kinds of views. One would say, U.S. needs to compete, more eagerly to counter the rise of China. The other would say, like Qin Gang, he pointed out in December that African continent could be a place for international cooperation instead of for geopolitical gains. So how do you see China and U.S. in any way their cooperation with Africa respectively will, in a sense, reinforce each other for the benefits of Africa?
So in terms of cooperation, I think it's good to start on the positive. In terms of cooperation, very recently there was an agreement between Google and Transsion. Transsion Holding is a major smartphone manufacturing company in Africa. Many of the brands, most of the brands that people hold and use on the continent belongs to the Transsion family. ITEL, as an example. Right. So yes, of course, we see that there is competition, but also there's cooperation, and that's in technology, for instance. But the issue is, and that needs to be emphasized, is that African countries themselves need to assert their agency when it comes to the issue of competition between the US and China, and ensuring that where Africa and China, US and China cannot cooperate or collaborate in Africa, it shouldn't lead to any form of confrontation within the continent. Because, for instance, if you even look at the infrastructure initiatives, you will often hear some Western think tanks or even some policy officials speak to how it will not make sense for a European bank to finance a road that connects a port where you have Chinese investment to a mine, and that's even though the road might meet all of the feasibility requirements, for instance. So there is a lot of issues when it comes to how the competition might affect the relationship. But overall, I think there's the responsibility of African countries to continue to insist on peace and what I like to describe as active pacifism, because without that strategic stability and in the global environment, I think there's going to be a lot of problems and for African countries and even for the world in general. So it is very crucial that that is being maintained, and African countries need to be more proactive in mentioning that. I'll end with this. One of the things you have to also look at is whenever you see African foreign ministers engage with their American counterpart, you will often hear them insist on them not wanting to choose between both sides. And that's because we often know that behind closed doors, there's so much pressure on African countries to take the US side against China. But whenever African leaders are meeting with Chinese, they don't see the need to express that same sentiment, because of course in their engagement, and of course I'm not in the meetings, but you could see that there's no that habit of putting pressure on African countries to choose is not characteristic of China-Africa relations. So as time goes on, of course, as if the dynamic heats up even further, African countries must continue to maintain their neutrality, because it's in the best interest of the world and the continent.
Mm-hmm. Professor Mahoney, I wonder, what's your view on that? Of course, whether African continent will become like a battleground for a new Cold War, or whether African nations can be proactively to balance their relationship with Beijing, with Washington, and let's put aside pressuring countries to make a choice.
Well, there are a number of points here. First, the U.S. is aiming to compete with China in Africa, and certainly has advanced efforts to this end. And this is largely through a combination of fear-mongering, pressure, in tandem with very modest supports. Second, however, is that China has a number of clear advantages in many African nations. And research indicates that many Africans, as has been already noted in this program, do appreciate the investment, the business opportunities, the development support, and so on. In fact, just this afternoon, I chaired a doctoral defense committee of a student from Botswana. And one of her most interesting findings is that although there is some form of soft and maybe even hard power competition between China and the Western Africa, this competition is not putting much downward pressure on African perceptions of China. Rather, China mainly seems to compete with itself in this regard. On the one hand, for doing some things that are very well perceived, supports, commitments of non-interference, the Belt and Road Initiative, and so on. While on the other hand, unfortunately, some Chinese companies, whether through extracting resources or building infrastructure or selling products, sometimes create negative impressions. And that's always going to be the case when you're dealing with so many players in a global market. Now, it does seem that the U.S. is committed to competition. But you know what? I'd like to see China doing more to get European support for initiatives like the Global Development Initiative. I think they could put a lot of pressure on European countries to join that. And we might see them breaking ranks with the U.S. as we saw previously, with some of them joining the AIIB. Now, whether or not this is good for Africa is questionable. There's an argument that it is, that it creates more opportunity for growth.
Competed to do good and to invest more in Africa. Well, Professor, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thanks for being with us. I'm Qin Gang. See you next time.